Hello, listeners! Welcome to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's golden age and the few years surrounding it. I am your host, Erin Carlson. This episode is dedicated to my lifelong friend Barb, who requested that I cover this individual. Thanks for the suggestion, Barb. You were right. What a story. Today, we will be discussing the jazz legend herself, Lady Day, Billie Holiday. My primary source for this episode was Billie's autobiography, Lady Sings the Blues, which she wrote with co-author William Dufty in 1956. The rest of my sources will be at the end of the show as usual. I want to preface by saying that I have never seen so much varying information out there in the world than I have with the story of Billie Holiday. I was shocked at the amount of inaccuracies I saw online while doing my research. My goal is to provide you with the most accurate information possible, so I always aim to use highly reputable sources. And what better reputable source than the words of the actual person we are talking about? So just know, if you decide to go out and do further research about the life of Billie Holiday, you're going to see a lot of differing information. But I did my best to piece together Billie's story in a way that pays her the tribute that she deserves in the most accurate way possible. So here we go. I'm going to start right out of the gate with a shocking opening sentence. Billie Holiday was born Eleanora Fagan in Baltimore, Maryland on April 7, 1915, to her 13-year-old mother, Sadie Fagan. Yes, 13. Sadie worked as a maid for a white family, and she worked long, grueling days until the day that she gave birth, at 13. Billie's father, Clarence Holiday, was 15 when she was born, and his parents did everything they could to pretend like their teenage son was not a father. But he loved Sadie and he loved their baby, so when they could afford to try and make it on their own, the young couple got married. Clarence was 18 and Sadie was 16 on their wedding day, and little Eleanora, our future Billie Holiday, was 3. Okay, I do want to mention that I got that information from Billie Holiday's own autobiography. However, I read in an e-news article and some other sources that Sadie was about 19 when she gave birth to Billie and Clarence was 17, and that they never got married. But they did not mention where they found that information. So I chose to use Billie's account because, well, it's her life. I'm going to start referring to little Eleanora as Billie now for the rest of the story, just to save on confusion. Clarence was sent off to war in the First World War not long after he and Sadie got married. They were both still just kids. When he returned from the war, he had new dreams for his life, and they did not include his wife and young daughter. He wanted to be a musician, so he left. Sadie was on her own now. She would have to ask her family for help so she could go off and make money. While Sadie worked out of town as a maid, Billie was sent to live with her grandparents. In a tiny home next to a junk store, that's how Billie referred to it, lived her grandparents, her great-grandmother, an adult cousin named Ida, and her 2 small children. It was tight, and they were very poor. Cousin Ida would regularly abuse Billie. Ida made living there very, very difficult for her. Billie's great-grandmother, which would have been Sadie's father's mother, was a former slave. Sadie's father, Billie's grandfather, was actually the son of the plantation owner. Her great-grandmother had given birth to 16 children by her master, according to Billie's autobiography. So Billie's grandfather was half Irish, half white, the son of a plantation owner and his slave. Needless to say, as a former slave, Billie's great-grandmother was tough. She and Billie had a very close and very special relationship. Billie recounted that nobody paid much attention to her great-grandmother. She was just an old woman to everyone else. But to little Billie, she was a goddess. She was the keeper of so much wisdom and so much strength. And then Billie's world was crushed when her great-grandmother died. And the grief would only be worsened by the beating she received from her cousin Ida for being the cause of her death. I'm going to read directly from Billie Holiday's autobiography to share this story. Quote, "She'd been sleeping in chairs for 10 years. The doctor had told her she'd die if ever she laid down. But I didn't know. And once after I'd changed the cloths on her legs and she had told me a story, she begged me to let her lie down. She said she was tired. I didn't want to let her, but she kept begging and begging. It was pitiful. Finally, I spread a blanket on the floor and helped her stretch out. Then she asked me to lie down with her because she wanted to tell me another story. I was tired too. I'd been up early that morning to scrub steps. So I laid down with her. I don't remember the story she told me because I fell asleep right away. I woke up 4 or 5 hours later. Grandma's arm was still tight around my neck and I couldn't move. I tried, and then I got scared. She was dead, and I began to scream. The neighbors came running. They had to break Grandma's arm to get me loose, and then they took me to a hospital. I was there for a month, suffering from what they said was shock." End quote. And then, as I said, Cousin Ida beat Billie for causing her grandmother's death. She was 97 years old and had been sick for years. And she died very peacefully, very happy, and very comfortable. But Billie was treated like a murderer. Billie had a lot of chores in their little home as a child, but she did find time for fun too. She enjoyed riding her bike, roller skating, and singing. Whatever she was doing, she was singing. She began working as a child. She would scrub porches and steps and bathroom and kitchen floors. And while she worked, she sang. She was also an errand girl for Alice Dean's, quote, whorehouse in the neighborhood. And instead of accepting money for her work, she worked for the chance to come in and listen to Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith's music on the Victrola. It was the only Victrola in town. Billie loved music. She loved money, but she loved music more. Billie said, quote, "I always wanted to sing like Louis Armstrong played. I always wanted to sing like an instrument," end quote. I think that's just beautiful. Little did she know, she would be performing with her idol one day, and her voice was indeed an instrument. In 1925, Billie experienced another trauma that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was 10 years old, and she was the victim of a violent rape. 10 years old. And it wasn't her only rape in her life. Her rapist was a 40-year-old man who she knew and trusted. He was apprehended, thank goodness, and sent to prison for 5 years. But Billie's sentence would end up being almost harsher than her rapist's. Remember, she was 10 years old. But she was accused of prostitution and fabricating the rape story, so she was sent to a strict Catholic reform school in order to punish her for her bad behavior. One of her punishments was being locked in a room with the body of a recently deceased girl and being forced to stay in there with her dead body all night long. She was 10 years old. And remember, Billie suffered a traumatic mental health episode when her great-grandmother died next to her, when she was trapped under her dead body. So as you can imagine, this experience of extreme mental abuse at the reform school had an absolutely horrible impact on her. After about a year in the reform school, her mother was able to get her out. But Sadie still couldn't care for Billie, so she was sent back to live with her grandparents, Ida, and the cousins. When Ida died a couple of years later, Sadie was forced then to take care of her own child. Billie finally joined her mother in Harlem. She was 13 years old. Billie said in her autobiography that her mother didn't have the means to house her in Harlem. I believe she was living in the home of the family she worked for. So she put her up in what she thought was a boarding house, but it was really a brothel. So, at 13 years old, Billie Holiday began working as a sex worker. The brothel was raided one morning, and teenage Billie was arrested for prostitution. She was actually the only one arrested because a prominent man who she had refused to have sex with had sent the police for her, and they seemed to look right past all the other girls. She was a child, an abandoned child, and she felt that she had no choice but to do this kind of work. When she was arrested, though, she decided she was going to reach for a better life. But she'd have to fulfill her sentence first. Time working in a hospital and time in what she called, quote, Welfare Island, a detention center for girls. After her time on Welfare Island, Billie was finally able to move in with her mother. When she was 15 years old, she started working at the Log Cabin and the Hotshot Club. She would sing whenever she had the chance. Before too long, she was on the stage at the Apollo Theater, and she knocked this first stage performance out of the park. And this was when Eleanora Fagan officially became Billie Holiday, inspired by film actress Billy Dove. I want to point out that however horribly she was treated by both her mother and her father, the abandonment she experienced from both of them, she loved them both dearly until her dying breath. Her mother would remain her best friend until Sadie passed away, and Billie paid tribute to her father, who had never been a presence in her life, by using his last name in her stage name. He had become a somewhat successful musician by this time, and Billie wanted to connect herself to him. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Billie was not given the love that every child deserves, but she held so much love for both of her parents in her heart until she died.
Have you ever wanted to travel to the past and follow the trails of crooks, killers, and outlaws from yesteryear, all from the safety of a time machine? Well, on the Vintage Villains podcast, I examine the people, the cases, and the zeitgeist of the year in question so we can learn what made folks tick back then and better understand that which plagues us in the overwhelming present. Subscribe to Vintage Villains now on your favorite music or podcatcher apps, and I'll be seeing you soon in another century.
In 1933, when Billie was 18 years old, music producer John Hammond saw her performing and he knew he had found gold in Billie Holiday. Hammond arranged for her to get into a recording studio with another budding musician, clarinetist and bandleader Benny Goodman, who would soon be known as the King of Swing. This was the first time that Goodman had ever recorded with a black musician. He had always refused, but Billie was so good it would be a huge mistake to refuse working with her. This was the launching point into stardom for Billie Holiday. Her life was about to change. She recorded hit after hit for the next 5 or 6 years and performed at better and better venues. One place she was a regular at was called Cafe Society. Cafe Society was a cabaret created to showcase musical talent, black and white. And black and white customers were welcomed and treated as complete equals under the roof of Cafe Society. This was unheard of in 1930s New York, or anywhere really. During that time, she met saxophonist Lester Young, and the two were musical soulmates. Lester Young's smooth sax accompanied Billie's soulful voice to perfection, and the two did many collaborations together, and they became best friends. Lester Young gave Billie her famous nickname, Lady Day. In 1937, at 22 years old, Billie joined Count Basie's band. Count Basie's band toured all over the country, but they generally played in small, dingy clubs during those early days of Billie's time with them, and they barely took home a cent. While touring in Detroit, which was between race riots at the time, theater management made a huge deal about Basie's band performing on the same stage as their white dancers. And then they declared that Billie was too light-colored, and they forced her to wear dark grease paint on her face, to perform in blackface so she was as black as the rest of her bandmates. Because God forbid anyone think a talented white woman was singing with a bunch of super talented black musicians. This was the kind of thing Billie Holiday had to put up with her entire life and career. Billie didn't last terribly long with Basie's band. There were varying accounts on whether she quit or she got fired, so I'm not really sure what happened there. Billie's father, Clarence Holiday, died in February of 1937. Both Billie and her mother, Sadie, were shocked and heartbroken, both for the same reason. Heartbroken over what could have been, what it was now too late for. Sadie had never gotten over Clarence. He was the love of her life. Clarence, however, seems to have been quite a busy boy. He had a wife named Fanny, which Sadie and Billie did know about. But that wasn't all. It turns out he had another woman, a white woman, that nobody seemed to know about. And that white woman, he had 2 children with her. Billie's half-brother and half-sister, who were both being raised as white. Surprise! But wait, there's more. There were also a few more women who claimed to be his exclusive partners. And all of this came to light at his funeral. Sounds like a pretty entertaining funeral. Back to Billie's career. After leaving Count Basie's band, Billie joined Artie Shaw's band. And as you can imagine, being a black female singer in a male white band was challenging, to say the least. If she was served at a restaurant while they were touring, she would order an extra burger and store it in her purse because she didn't know when she'd be able to be served again because of the color of her skin. She often had to sleep in the bus or car because she wasn't allowed to enter some of the hotels that they were able to find along their way. The band tried their best to accommodate her, but it was often difficult to find desegregated establishments. Billie toured with Artie Shaw and his band for a year and a half. She said in Lady Sings the Blues, quote, "Don't tell me about these pioneer chicks hitting the trail in those slip-covered wagons with the hills full of redskins. I am the girl who went west in 1937 with 16 white cats, Artie Shaw, and his Rolls Royce," end quote. Cats meaning men, not actual cats, just for clarification. In 1939, on the stage at Cafe Society, Billie first sang the song that would become her legacy, Strange Fruit. Strange Fruit was a very powerful song with a very powerful message. Strange Fruit was a poem about lynchings in the South, and the music was written for the poem specifically for Billie Holiday. The song is thought to be the first protest song during the Civil Rights era. It is a raw and emotional song. She was using her platform to spread the message of what Black people had gone through and continued to go through. And white people did not like this, but she sang on. The power of Strange Fruit's lyrics deeply affected Billie every single time she sang it on stage. She would have to retreat to the bathroom after every performance. "When I sang it, it affects me so much I get sick. It takes all the strength out of me," she said in her book. Billie wanted to record Strange Fruit, but her record label refused to record it. No way, they said. So she sought out a small independent label to get it recorded. She wanted this song heard by as many people as possible. Although Strange Fruit saw its share of pushback in its early days, it is recognized as one of the most influential and important songs in history. It was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 1978, and in 2002, it was preserved in the Library of Congress National Recording Registry. But back to the 40s. It wasn't just some of the white public that didn't like to hear the lyrics of Strange Fruit. It was also some members of white law enforcement. We don't need to be bringing attention to things like public lynchings, right? Well, that was their thought. And thus began Billie Holiday becoming a national scapegoat for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Billie Holiday's stardom was huge, and her drug habit had gotten pretty huge as well. She was doing heroin, cocaine, an assortment of pills, lots of booze, and lived in a cloud of pot smoke. The heroin was thanks to the new man in her life. Billie married a man named Jimmy Monroe in 1941. They were legally married for 6 years, but it sounds like they were only together for a fraction of that time before separating. just enough time for Jimmy to get Billie hooked on heroin. Jimmy was a cheating alcoholic and smoked a ton of opium. In 1945, Billie's best friend, her mother Sadie, died before she even hit the age of 50. Billie did not want to depend on drugs. She wanted to be clean. So much so that after her mother's death, she checked herself into a rehab facility, or sanitarium as it was called then, for 3 weeks and devoted everything she had to getting clean and staying clean. After 3 weeks of treatment, she walked out the door of the facility optimistic for her future. And then she saw law enforcement officials outside and quickly realized that they were following her. And they continued to follow her for over a year. Actually, for the rest of her life. Harry Anslinger was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was the newest government agency since the end of Prohibition, and he was out for blood with Billie Holiday. You see, Mr. Anslinger didn't care for black people, he didn't care for jazz music, and he didn't care for drugs. And Billie Holiday was a highly visible public image who fit the bill of all three. So he was going to send a message to the entire nation through Billie Holiday. Harry Anslinger began the national quest on the war on drugs, decades before Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. But Harry Anslinger was an extreme racist, and he had no interest in actually helping addicts. He wanted to punish addicts. More specifically, he wanted to punish black addicts. Agent Anslinger began by ordering Billie Holiday to stop singing Strange Fruit, but she refused. And this pissed Harry Anslinger off. So in May of 1947 in Philadelphia, Billie Holiday was arrested and charged with heroin possession. Actually, when agents first tried to arrest her outside of her hotel, she carjacked her own car from her chauffeur and sped off with him in the passenger seat and her terrified dog in the back seat while agents fired shots at them in the car. It was her first time ever driving a car. Authorities eventually caught up with her, she was arrested, and she was sentenced to 1 year in prison. Billie pleaded with the judge to allow her to spend her sentence in a hospital so she could receive treatment for her addiction. But Agent Anslinger fought hard against this and the idea that drug addiction was a medical condition at all. It was a crime and had nothing to do with medical treatment, period. So, Billie Holiday was sent to the Federal Reformatory for Women in West Virginia. She did her time, and she came back still on top. Billie Holiday was released from prison, and 10 days later, she performed sold-out shows at Carnegie Hall. From prison to Carnegie Hall, she still had it. But as part of her punishment from her drug conviction, her cabaret card was revoked. A little extra slap in the face from Agent Anslinger. This meant she could not perform in any venues that served alcohol, which was pretty much everywhere she performed. He wanted her to suffer by being unable to perform, especially her song Strange Fruit. Billie was trying really hard to stay clean. She would go several months without using drugs, and she was able to stay clean for quite a while after her release from prison. In January of 1949, however, Billie was arrested in San Francisco for heroin possession. Agent Anslinger wasn't done with her yet. It is highly speculated that an agent planted evidence in Billie's hotel room. Billie was adamant that she wasn't using, and she begged to be sent to a hospital so she could be monitored for withdrawal symptoms, so they could see that she wasn't going to be experiencing any because she was clean. The jury in her case must have believed some of what she claimed because she was found not guilty on this possession charge. This was a very difficult thing to go through again. Billie wrote of the experience, quote, "The hounding and pressure drove me to think of trying the final solution, death," end quote. So sad. Billie claimed several times in her book that federal agents only seemed to come for her when she was actually clean. She wasn't shy in sharing that she was using drugs a lot throughout her life, but when she was brought down by the feds, it was always in one of her clean spells. She said she would go months being high more than not, and they would never come around then. And then the minute she tries to make positive changes to her life again, here comes the feds. Billie Holiday spent the next several years going through the repeating cycle of addiction and remission. She wanted so badly to live a clean life, but the addiction had a tight hold on her and she had no means of recovery support. The constant attacks against her just fueled her need for an escape through drugs. It was a vicious cycle. Billie continued to sing Strange Fruit whenever and wherever she could. No matter what pushback she received, she kept singing it. Whatever hardship she experienced as a result of her addiction, she kept singing it. She had more drug arrests, but she kept singing. Billie married Louis McKay sometime in the mid-50s. I read varying accounts on the exact year. According to people close to Billie, Louis was a master of gaslighting, manipulation, and emotional abuse, and they got into endless physical altercations. He wanted her money and control of her, and he wanted nothing more. He whittled her down to nothing, and he took every cent of her money. Again, this is according to her friends. But according to her, she was happy with him. At least that's the sense I got from her autobiography. They were even able to achieve something neither one of them ever thought possible, a grand trip through Europe in 1954 while Billie performed a very successful European tour of performances. And she loved it, especially her time in London. She loved the people, the acceptance, and the kindness in every country they visited. It was the thrill of her life, and I'm so happy that she had that. I love this little story she shared in her book about their stay in London. She said she grew tired of the fancy hotel food, so she cooked up a can of red beans that she had brought with her from home on a little camp stove right there in the hotel. She'd gone out to pick up some meat, rice, and garlic, and she started making her own meal. The smell attracted employees of the hotel, and she thought she was for sure getting thrown out. But the opposite happened. They all wanted to try it, and they all loved it. We had a ball, she said, and I'm still sending dried red beans to people in London today. Billie and Louis were arrested together in 1956 in a Philadelphia hotel room after a show in Philly. Billie said they were both sober, yet they both spent the night in jail. The sad reality of Billie Holiday's life was that she had to thoroughly search every hotel room she ever stayed in when she arrived to make sure there was nothing planted in there. At one hotel room in LA, they found a couple of joints stashed. And then there was the arrest at that San Francisco hotel in 1949. She made a good point. The authorities knew where she lived, but she was only ever arrested in hotel rooms. Hotel rooms with easy access while she was away. I know that addicts can lie about their use, I know that. But Billie Holiday was very candid about her drug use and her struggles with addiction in her book. So when she said she wasn't using at certain times, I believe she wasn't using. Billie Holiday filed for divorce from Louis McKay in 1958, but she wouldn't live to sign the papers that would end her marriage. Billie collapsed in July of 1959 and was admitted to the hospital. Actually, the first hospital she was brought to refused to treat her because of her drug addiction. She was actively using at the time of her collapse and was high on heroin. Luckily, the next hospital took her in. She was diagnosed with liver disease. Shortly after being admitted to the hospital, she began going through heroin withdrawal. And then good old Agent Anslinger pops into the hospital. Do you think he was there to present her with a beautiful bouquet of get-well flowers? Nope. He was there to arrest her. She was extremely ill and going through drug withdrawal, and he arrested her right there in her hospital bed. Billie was so sick, so tired, so defeated. She didn't have the fight in her anymore to fight against Agent Anslinger. Billie Holiday died on July 17, 1959, from complications associated with her drug use. She was only 44 years old. Shortly before her death, as she continued her years-long battle with both addiction and Agent Harry Anslinger, she said, quote, "Imagine if the government chased sick people with diabetes, drove insulin into the black market, and told doctors they couldn't treat them, and then sent them to jail. If we did that, everyone would know we were crazy. We do practically the same thing every day to sick people hooked on drugs." End quote. If you are concerned about your drug or alcohol use, help is available. Billie Holiday couldn't receive the help she so desperately wanted, but you can. You can call or text the 988 Lifeline at 988, or you can call the National Substance Abuse Hotline at 1-866-210-1303. Now, I would like to share a couple of extra things I learned about Billie Holiday during my research. I only have a couple because I already shared some pretty intense information about her life. Bullet point number 1. Every other word that came out of Billie Holiday's mouth was a swear word. Those close to her said if she didn't regularly call you a mother effer, she didn't love you. Bullet point number 2. Billie Holiday was posthumously awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1986. She was also posthumously inducted in the Grammy Hall of Fame, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Blues Hall of Fame, and the Big Band and Jazz Hall of Fame. That's pretty amazing. Bullet point number 3. Frank Sinatra, a musical god himself, called Billie Holiday his greatest single musical influence. She was definitely a one-of-a-kind musical artist. Bullet point number 4. Billie Holiday appeared in one Hollywood movie, 1946's New Orleans. She agreed to do the movie under the belief that she would be playing herself in maybe a cabaret scene. But no, she would be playing a maid because she was a black woman. But she did get to sing in the film, and she got to do it alongside Louis Armstrong and his trumpet. 2 beautiful instruments joined together. In conclusion, Billie Holiday entered this world at a severe disadvantage and endured the hardest of hardships in her early life. She was raped multiple times, even as a child, and she was forced into a life of sex work at a very young age. She had such an intimate relationship with poverty that the Great Depression didn't affect her life. She had lived that life her entire childhood. Billie knew she wanted a better life for herself, and she used her soulful voice to achieve that better life. But the demons of her past and a terrible husband sent her onto the path of addiction, a path that she wasn't able to free herself from. The help and resources to help her simply didn't exist for her. Instead, she was targeted for it. Those close to Billie Holiday described her as a very vulnerable woman addicted to abusive relationships, someone who regularly inflicted harm onto herself, someone with low self-worth, someone who seemed to chase a life of misery and suffering. But let us remember her story, the life that she was born into. She was born to children. She was abandoned by both her father and her mother as a child. She was constantly abused by her caregiver. The most positive person in her life, her great-grandmother, died next to her, literally trapping her under her rigor mortis body. She was raped when she was 10 years old, and that was followed by other rapes. She worked in a brothel when she was a young teenager. She was used, abused, betrayed, and let's not forget putting up with racism on a daily basis through her entire life. So she didn't choose vulnerability. She didn't choose abusive relationships. She didn't choose self-harm. She didn't choose low self-worth. She didn't choose a life of misery and suffering. She was born into an extremely difficult life, and the circumstances of her early experiences molded her mind in negative ways. Her mental health and perception of healthy relationships were compromised as a child. She had no idea better existed, not for her at least. I think she was pretty damn strong. I want to end with a passage from Billie's book, Lady Sings the Blues. These are words she wrote in 1956, just 3 years before her death, after all the terrible things she had endured, all the betrayal and mistreatment, all the hope and shattered dreams. She said, quote, "Look at my big dream. It's always been to have a big place of my own out in the country someplace where I could take care of stray dogs and orphan kids. Kids that didn't ask to be born. Kids that didn't ask to be black, blue, or green, or something in between. I'd only want to be sure of one thing, that nobody in the world wanted these kids. Then I would take them, end quote. She wanted this and a club of her own, a club that welcomed everyone. Through it all she wanted was to open her heart to others, so other children didn't have to go through the nightmares that she did. She wanted other children to feel the love that she never had. Thank you, Billie Holiday, for singing the harsh truth of racism. Thank you for sacrificing your own freedom for that song. You made a difference. You mattered. And thank you all for listening. If you are interested in supporting the show on Patreon and receiving some fun bonus content as a thank you, hop on over to patreon.com/Stars of the Golden Age podcast to check out the tiers of support and what extra content is available there. Please follow the show on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And if you love the show, please leave a 5-star rating where you listen to your podcasts. If you have an episode request, you can email me at goldenagestars@gmail.com. My main source for this episode was Billie Holiday's autobiography titled Lady Sings the Blues by Billie Holiday and William Dufty. I also watched the 2019 documentary called Billie, billieholidayofficial, an episode of Throughline by NPR from October 7th, 2020 titled The United States vs. Billie Holiday, an E! News article by Natalie Finn from April 23rd, 2021, biography.com, and of course, my other half, IMDB.